I was supposed to write a book on refuting Sam Harris, but because of his public debates and the nature of the material, I think it would be best if it was eventually published in video format instead of a book. But I want to point out that my earlier videos on the YouTube channel were against Salafism, the extremist strain of Islam found in Saudi Arabia in the 1800s and funded and financed by British imperialism and encouraged by American capitalism. And now it's just a monster with its tentacles in basically every country. And the way out for Muslims, the first thing Muslims should be doing is condemning the acts of suicide bombing. And in my younger years, I was very pro-Palestinian, and I would have justified anything to disagree with Israel. But looking forward now, a suicide bombing is an act which is done by a very powerful country, and then they're taking advantage of somebody who has no power and no money and no agency in life. So it's a very sad situation. But I remember back in the days of Saddam Hussein, he was sending about 15,000 to every family of a suicide bomber, and they're funded by countries like Iran and such. So it's a very desperate situation, but ultimately my reasoning is that you wouldn't wrap explosives around a cat or a dog. So how could you do it around a human being? It's just an unconscionable, reprehensible act. But having said that, Sam Harris begins his book by pointing out that the family of a suicide bomber, while mourning the loss of their son, is still joyful, and so is the community at somebody's death, the way they blew themselves apart, and they sent shrapnel into other human beings to make the explosive more deadly. And I think that's really unfair for many reasons. But first of all, the practice of suicide bombing, so he says that, well, you could bet your life on it, almost, of which religion this suicide bomber would be. And it's really unfair because the practice of suicide bombing began with the Tamil Tigers, which is a Sri Lankan group. And this argument comes from Israeli right-wing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And he says that the single contribution of Palestinians to the world is the suicide bombing. And it's really unfair for multiple reasons, but it's in contrast to what Israel has contributed to the world: AOL Instant Messenger, technology, Waze, other startup companies. But obviously people living in first world luxury have the standard of living to make a contribution to the world. But if you give them a lower standard of living, a subhuman standard of living, then they're not able to contribute advanced physics and Nobel Prize winning work to the world. So I don't really think that's an argument. But anyway, Daniel Dennett actually makes this argument. So, Sam Harris is really borrowing this argument, and he's amplifying it. And he's starting his book with it. But Daniel Dennett gave a TED Talk around the same time Sam Harris gave his original TED Talk. And he spoke about an ant that was infected with a parasite.
And yet people are interestingly resistant to the idea of applying evolutionary thinking to our thinking. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So you're out in the woods or you're out in the pasture and you see this ant crawling up this blade of grass. It climbs up to the top and it falls and it climbs and it falls and it climbs, trying to stay at the very top of the blade of grass. And you think, what is this ant doing? What is this in aid of? What goals is this ant trying to achieve by climbing this blade of grass? What's in it for the ant? And the answer is nothing. There's nothing in it for the ant. Well then, why is it doing this? Is it just a fluke? Yeah, it's just a fluke. It's a lancet fluke. It's a little brainworm. It's a parasitic brainworm that has to get into the stomach of a sheep or a cow in order to continue its life cycle. So salmon, swim upstream to get to their spawning grounds, and lancet flukes commandeer a passing ant, crawl into its brain, and drive it up a blade of grass like an all-terrain vehicle. So there's nothing in it for the ant. The ant's brain has been hijacked by a parasite that infects the brain, inducing suicidal behavior. Pretty scary. Well, does anything like that happen with human beings? This is all on behalf of a cause other than one's own genetic fitness, of course. Well, it may already have occurred to you that Islam means surrender or submission of self-interest to the will of Allah. Well, it's ideas, not worms, that hijack our brains. Now, am I saying that a sizable minority of the world's population has had their brain hijacked by parasitic ideas? Oh, it's worse than that. Most people have. There are a lot of ideas to die for. Freedom, if you're from New Hampshire. Justice, truth, communism. Many people have laid down their lives for communism, and many have laid down their lives for capitalism, and many for Catholicism, and many for Islam. These are just a few of the ideas that are to die for. They're infectious.
Come out dead, but at least the parasites get to reproduce. And he says evolution has created this, but the ant is not dumb per se, but the parasite has taken over. And he says that religion is like this parasite. It is an ideology which causes you to act against your self-interest. And on the surface, it's a very convincing argument. But once you look at it, there are things worth giving your life up for, including ideologies like freedom, or the safety of your family, or the future safety of your country. So, and we celebrate it the same way. So Sam Harris can talk about it the same way, but when we lose special forces in a midnight operation, and the bodies come home to an Air Force base in Maryland, and the president greets the families, and the families are upset, but at the same time, they don't project their anger at the president who ordered them into combat, because they understand that their child performed a duty to the country, and they were sacrificed for supposedly the greater good. So they become a martyr to the state. They become a martyr to the nation. And it is actually noble to die for a cause. I would not suggest you go and find one. I think you should spend your life, if you want to die so much, I think you should give blood every 60 days and then really think about how much you could really be helping people if you just gave blood every 60 days. But you are very much needed, with a brain, with compassion, with 2 arms, 2 legs. People are very much needed in this world, especially compassionate and thinking people. But I don't think that suicide bombing is a great way to start off criticizing Islam. It's a false argument. Altruism is actually part of human nature, and to give up your life, let's say there's ethics and philosophical questions. Let's say you're driving a bus full of octogenarians, and everybody's 80 or 90 years old, and they have 1 foot in the grave, and I'm 32 years old, so I've lived a good life myself. And so you are driving a bus full of octogenarians. You're about to run over on a mountain pass a class of elementary school children. Should you swerve and take the octogenarians and yourself off the highway and fall off the mountain into the abyss to save the class of kindergarten children? Probably, because we've all lived our lives. But obviously there's different... People are also cowards, so people may decide differently. People may decide to save themselves. But I think we can agree on some level that there are instances where sacrificing yourself would be a noble thing, and your community and society would celebrate you. For example, we had the Virginia Tech shooting, where there was a teacher who survived the Holocaust, and then he threw himself in front of the door to stop the shooter from coming in, and he took the bullets for his students. And so therefore, you can say, well, this is a foolish ant, or this is a foolish person. And again, mind you, I'm not defending the act of suicide bombing, but just by the fact that a religion or a country has convinced someone to sacrifice themselves. For example, I was just reading an article in my favorite magazine, Harper's Magazine, but they pointed out that World War I was started out by Gavrilo Princip, who was a radical Serbian lone gunman, supposedly, but he was recruited by Serbian intelligence at the time. So it was really nationalism that caused World War I. And then obviously we know it caused World War II. and we are witnessing a resurgence of nationalism today. But you can have, and again, the example of the Tamil Tiger screams at you, like they've conducted hundreds of suicide bombings more than Hamas. And mind you, another point is that I believe the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was doing suicide bombings back in the 2000s. That was a secular group. So again, this has more to do with the desperation of the Palestinian cause at the time, and also the fact that rich countries were paying organizations and individuals to become suicide bombers. So there was vested interests in using helpless people as shrapnel, and it's really reprehensible. But there was a lot going on, and I don't think it can be blamed on the religion alone. Mind you, it's also terrorism is a tactic used the world over, mostly by insurgent groups against formal militaries with overwhelming firepower advantage. So I'm not convinced by this. I will say, though, I was very impressed by his argument that any kind of moderation among religious moderates such as myself is therefore a capitulation to the past 2 centuries of science and reason. And it's a very narrow view of history to say that religious people were just killing people left and right with no civilization until science and reason came about. And then anyone who believes in civilization is capitulating to science and reason. He admits that every religion has had ecumenical strains, and this is from the beginning, and this is where we differ. For him, religion is the idea of radical Puritanism, that's real religion, and anybody who advocates a softer kind of religion or mystical and pluralistic kind of religion is simply watering it down. And I really view it's the opposite, because first of all, like I said, Wahhabism is a fundamentalist strain that was founded in the 19th century and encouraged by British imperialists like Lawrence of Arabia, and American capitalism by the 20th century, of course. And to this very day, as we see, they can murder innocent people, and they have a very strategic alliance with the United States. But the real thing is that Islamic history is not defined by intolerance. It's really, mysticism has been a large part of it. But again, my point of view is that the origins of religion are mystical, and any true Platonic immaterial ideology, it becomes hijacked by materialist bourgeois interests and middle-class social structures to become a more normative and patriarchal and status quo enforcing mechanism, rather than the revolutionary radical ideology that it originally was. And so, to be quite concrete about what my interests are about religion is, I'm not interested in Christianity, for example, as the official religion of the Roman Empire. I'm interested in Christianity as a religion of the persecuted people who were thrown to the lions, and when churches had to be conducted in underground tombs, catacombs, and caves and secret safe houses because it was forbidden to meet in public. To me, that was the real religion, and at some point it sold out and became an imperial outreach. But so therefore he confuses this. He kind of takes the power structure of medieval society and he confuses that with the true faith, which was an ascetic and hermetical, if I can say, mystery religion and philosophy known only to a few, transmitted person to person. And to really understand religion, you need a master-disciple relationship. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. But I feel like this is my first response to reading the first few pages of Sam Harris's book. He makes very good arguments, but upon closer inspection, I don't think it has any validity. And thank you for watching. Have a good day.